Adult Ed, the Marshmallow Adult Ed Institute. Another edition of that. Very excited to have Rabbi Dovid Bashevkin with us tonight. I would encourage everybody who can to show yourselves and not hide behind the videos. It's much nicer when we see people's faces. But if you're in your bathrobes, we understand. So just a word about our illustrious guest, Rabbi Dovid Bashevkin. He's a rabbi, a writer, a professor, a podcast host. He's got his hands in quite a bit of things. It's very hard to keep track. After he studied in Ner Yisrael, he completed a smicha at RITZ, and he also received a master's degree at Revel, focusing on the thought of Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin under the guidance of Dr. Elman. We have at least one Yotzei Chaletzei Elman on the Zoom right here.
Miza.
You can wave your hand, his daughter, and I thought we might have
Dr. Elman's daughter is on the call?
Yes.
Wow.
She's waving. Do you see her? Samuel Levy, under Samuel Levy.
Wow, that's a big covet to even be together. I just wrote an article about your father and tradition.
I read a lot of the things that you wrote about him, and I appreciate them from the bottom of my heart.
Wow, this is special for me. Okay, also a lot more pressure.
Good.
Yes.
Never think so. Never think so.
Our one half of our presidium is also a son of Elman and an Elman.
Wow.
I don't see him. But let me finish the intros, and then you can take it away. So Rabbi Bashevkin is also currently the director of education of NCSY. He's a professor at YU, where he teaches courses on public policy, religious crisis, and rabbinic thought. He's a columnist for Mishpacha magazine, where he's written a humor column called Top 5. And what I know Rabbi Bashevkin from, who I learned about just this year, is through his new initiative called 1840. It's a new media company that helps users find meaning in their lives through exploration of Jewish thought and ideas. There's a website with relevant content, and then what's been wonderful for me, a podcast, tackle topics as diverse as comedy, biblical criticism, mysticism, science and religion, and right now we're in the middle of social justice. The podcasts are conversations with Jews as diverse as comedians like Gary Gulman and Leah Forster, and Rosh Yeshiva such as Rabbi Jeremy Weider, academics such as Dr. Ora Wiskin-Elper. It's really a fantastic series. And I'll probably just steal all his guests for our Adult Ed Institute. It's been great ideas there. But I think Acharon Chaviv, Rabbi Bashevkin, has notably been rejected from several prestigious fellowships and awards, which he is very fond of telling the world. But without further ado, Rabbi Bashevkin.
So thank you so much for that really warm introduction. The only thing that's bittersweet is that we're not gathering together in person and get to meet. And I'm taken aback. I'm genuinely so deeply moved to have Dr. Elman's daughter here. It's really something very special to me. He had an incredible impact and role in my life. And much of what we're going to be talking about tonight is really Torah, ideas, perspective, and history. He was a Renaissance man par excellence who brought together disparate disciplines. And I said once, if Rabbi Soloveitchik was halachic man, then Dr. Elman I would call omni-significant man. He saw significance in everything and for everything. And there was a combination of scholarship, depth, emotion, and inspiration in one person that we so rarely see, and he really had a tremendous impact on me. So this is very exciting. I feel like I would almost want to stop talking and turn the camera over to his daughter. I'm not going to do that. We will proceed as planned. So tonight is New Year's Eve. It's December 31st. I assume if there is Zoom burnout, there's probably also Corona burnout. We've also heard every single shiur on halachic aspects of Corona and different questions that have come up, Zoom minyanim and Zoom Pesach Seders and Zoom Shavuos. We've done all of that, but I still want, without mentioning the specifics of what went on this year, at the very least, I do think we have an opportunity to reflect on what the uniqueness of this year has been. The Medrash in Parshas Noach, which is a beautiful Medrash that I've shared once already, where right in the beginning of Parshas Noach, you'll notice in the Psukim, it repeats Noach's name 3 times. And the Medrash says the reason why it repeats Noach's name 3 times, I can take out a chumash and read it for you, but you open up right in the beginning of the Parsha. Elah told us Noach, Noah. It just keeps on repeating his name. We know who they're talking about. And the Parsha says, the Medrash says on this beginning to the Parsha something so beautiful. It says that there are really 3 Noachs. There's one Noach, that's the Noach before the flood. There's a second Noach, that's the Noach during the flood. And there's a third Noach that emerges following the flood. And I think on the precipice of the end of a new year, the precipice of what feels like we're turning the corner in the way that our lives have been so seriously hampered with such suffering and difficulty and all of these things, we all now are at a point where we can reach out and touch that first Noach, that pre-Noach personality before the flood. We know what it was like, Noach during the flood, and we're just about starting to reach out and could almost taste what that Noach reality is going to be like following the flood. But I think that this moment in time is really interesting to reflect on Jewish history. As was mentioned in the introduction, and I'm not plugging anything, I'm not plugging books, I'm not plugging podcasts, you don't have to look anything up. But I did start a media site called 1840. It's 18 and 40 is spelled out Forty. And I remember the reason why it started is actually quite fascinating. There was a person, a very well-to-do person, who was a money manager for many years. He had one child, and his child, after 12 years of Jewish education, went off to college and came back and felt bereft of anything Jewish, felt that Judaism no longer spoke to him. And he came to me with a bunch of different ideas about what we could do to stem the tide, what he called, the leaky roof of orthodoxy that we have today. In many ways, it feels like Charles Dickens once wrote, it's the best of times and the worst of times. In some ways, our community has expanded in ways that we could have never imagined. Compared it to what conservative Judaism likely felt like in the early 1940s. When my father grew up in that world, that was considered the future. Marshall Sklar, who was the great conservative sociologist, where he wrote essays basically saying, this is the wave of the future. It's never going to change. Nothing's going to be different. And the reason why conservative Jewry, Marshall Sklar was writing already in the 50s and 60s, is because unfortunately Orthodoxy is going to die out. And as somebody who went to yeshiva with Marshall Sklar's grandson, Yoda Sklar and Ner Yisroel, that's not what happened. And the scholarship of Marshall Sklar, I'm not knocking it. It's actually quite wonderful. He was a fabulous sociologist of Judaism. But you have to ask yourself, as a community, we've grown by leaps and bounds. We've gotten so much bigger, so much stronger, the Orthodox community. Kanai Nahar, there's so much bracha. But sometimes it feels like as our home has expanded, there are little leaks in the roof. There are little leaks in the roof, and there are a lot of millennials, a lot of younger people who are looking around, taking so much of what we built for granted, and they're asking themselves, like, what's the value add of all of this? What's the value add of all of the commitment? What's the value add of staying connected to Yiddishkeit and Orthodoxy and everything that we've done? Is this just a culture club? What is it that we are, in fact, building? And he came to me with this question, and he said, let's start an initiative. This wasn't his first idea. He first wanted to go to the high schools. I told him breaking into the high schools is very difficult to deal with all the heads of schools and the politics. Let's try to use the internet and see what happens. But our first debate that I had with this partner was what to call it. And I came to him because I'm very mischievous. I'm always looking to find tributes to my teachers in unexpected ways. I said, let's call it 1840. And he said, what, 1840? He got very nervous. He's a very politically conservative guy. He was getting flashbacks from the New York Times Project. He was getting flashbacks from Nate Silver. Anything that has a number for a name was not this person's cup of tea. I said, well, why do we have to call it that? Why don't we call it, like J Question or J Wow or J Experience? I told him, I think as a community, we've ran out of acronyms that have the letter J in it. I think we're done. I think we're done with acronyms with the letter J. There are no more permutations left. It's like Gary Gulman's bit when they were trying to find acronyms for all the states. And they started with, Alabama was very easy, AL, but once they start going on, you run out of permutations. I told them, we ran out of J acronyms. We got to find something new. And I said, and this is before 2020, I said, I want to start with 1840 because I believe that the moment in time that we are at in history, we've seen this before collectively in our unconscious in the secular calendaric year of 1840. And allow me to explain why. I want to begin with a New York Times book review from a fabulous book, and we'll have plenty of book recommendations. I want to make sure that you can see the screen. I will make it as big as possible. Let me know if you have any trouble seeing anything. This is from the New York Times book review of a wonderful book by Orlando Figes called The Europeans: 3 Cosmopolitan Lives and the Making of a European Subculture. And what the book is about is the changing tides that were happening in Europe and how people in Europe suddenly became very liberal and open-minded and cosmopolitan. Let's read this review. Imagine a society where within the space of a single generation, human innovation all but collapses the most formidable geographic distances, allowing individuals and information to travel the globe with unprecedented swiftness and ease, where new platforms radically transform the ways in which news, music, books, and art are created and consumed, where media-driven celebrity trumps older modes of authority and forms new elites, endowing famous artists and performers with peerless cachet, where audiences converge in a worldwide culture of sharing, and diversity and connectedness join equality and freedom as the shibboleths of Western liberalism, where at the same time legislation struggles to keep pace with technological change, capitalism and consumerism destroy even as they enrich, and nationalism, racism, and xenophobia poison the public discourse, threatening disaster. This is the society Orlando Figes examines in The Europeans: 3 Lives and the Making of a Cosmopolitan Culture. And it is the world of mid-19th century Europe, an international culture that vanished on the outbreak of the First World War. The Europeans begins by discussing the inauguration of the 1840s of Europe first international railroad line. 1840, if you read that description, is literally the moment that we just experienced. Geographic boundaries have totally collapsed. We get together. There's no, even the notion of local shul programming, which I love and I'm fighting to preserve. All of a sudden, there was this 6-week stretch, if you all remember, where every shul was, connecting and collaborating. It was a Shweki concert via Zoom, and the next day was Miami Boys Choir, and the next day was a carnival and magic shows. And there were no boundaries anymore. Everything was for everybody. There is a world that we're moving into now in this online universe where our geographic boundaries have all but evaporated, where the hierarchy of authority has been turned over its head. And if you read that and thought that he was talking and describing 2020, you wouldn't be wrong, because that's deliberate. We're repeating something that has already happened in the 1840s. Now, I believe that the significance of the 1840s is not just a secular story. It happens to be an extraordinarily Jewish story, which we will explore tonight. The reason why it's an extraordinarily Jewish story, and we'll talk about how this year has been featured in different Jewish spaces in very unique ways. But let me just cut right to the chase. We began with the 3 Noachs. The Parsha of Noach, if you look in books, in Svarim that talk about Hasidus, the Parsha of Noach has a special place in the Torah and the ideas associated with Hasidus and the Baal Shem Tov. All of the Baal Shem Tov's ideas about tefillah, about davening, appear in Parshas Noach. all of the ideas about the development of human innovation appear in Parshas Noach. But there's something else that appears in Parshas Noach, and that is a Zohar, which we will read inside, believe it or not. I'll show it to you in a little bit. The Zohar points to the year 1840 as something very significant. 1840 on the Hebrew calendar is the 6th century of the 6th millennia. If you count 6 millennia and 6 centuries, that comes to the year 5600, which is the year 1840, or really 1839, 1840. And the Zohar writes that that is a year of transition and change. It's a year of trauma and discovery. And that's why, if you look at Hasidic works, the Parsha of Noach is such a central Parsha, because it is the Parsha where we learn how to transition from into what we now call new normals. It's those 3 Noachs. It's the before, during, and after. It's learning how to transition pre-trauma, trauma, post-trauma, to take situations and transitions in our lives and infuse them with meaning. Now, before we dive into more Hasidic ideas, I want to share with you something really amazing about American Jewish history. There is an absolutely wonderful book by a conservative scholar named Abraham. His name escapes me. It's called Jewish Continuity in America, Creative Survival in a Free Society. I'm going to make this much bigger. He's an absolutely wonderful historian. Absolutely wonderful. This is a book that is way out of print, but is absolutely worth buying. Book recommendation number 2, Jewish Continuity in America. It just got chock full of these wonderful stories about American Jewish history, the story of the first chief rabbi. And this is what he writes. Initially, attempts were made to fashion an American Judaism. The first attempt at a national religious union had its roots in a far-off anti-Jewish outrage, the so-called Damascus affair. Following the disappearance of a Catholic priest there in February of our favorite year, 1840, the Jews of Damascus were accused of his murder in order to take his blood for use in their unleavened bread. A classic blood libel. We were killing Christians to bake our matzahs. Scores were imprisoned, children were seized and held as hostages, and a wide-scale massacre was imminent. Jewish communities the world over were shocked and aroused, and those who dared organize and speak protest did so. The news from Syria in 1840 galvanized the Jews of America into action. The Jews of New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and Richmond united in communal expression of horror, sympathy, and indignation. Participation in a common cause, this is the important part, so excited the emotions brought the scattered and disparate elements of the American Jewish community together in a communion of spirit and concern. It has been suggested that modern Jewish history dates from that Damascus affair in 1840. Certainly, the American Jewish community had its beginnings as a self-conscious entity in the activity precipitated by the massacre of Damascus. Now, I've always thought this is absolutely fascinating and somewhat sad, actually. Oh, Abraham Karp. Thank you, Mike S. I very much appreciate that. Yes, I'm trying to keep track of the chats over here. And you can feel free to speak up. I love an active chat. I've taught on Zoom since March in Yeshiva University, so I'm used to it. Keep the chats going. Any book recommendations that I missed or links to Amazon, Rabbi Schiffman, thank you for that, are very much appreciated. If we can't be together, at least we can have books in our hands. Probably my one luxury that has skyrocketed, book buying during Corona. We could do a separate conference on that, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't do one already. I presented at an academic conference in November on shelfies during Corona. We did a whole conference on how people present their identity based on the books in their background, which has made me even more self-conscious but I have transformed my own self-consciousness into the self-consciousness of others by commenting on their backgrounds, as Mrs. Pop can tell you all. The first thing that I notice whenever I jump on these calls. There's really something amazing in this story, and that is the dating of modern American Jewish history, beginning with the first self-conscious coming together of disparate Jewish communities, where the American Jewish community realized two things. Number one, they realized themselves as their own, oh, Dr. Pop, I'm so sorry about that. That's my mistake. That's my mistake. The American Jewish community got back together. Thank you so much. The American Jewish community got together. There was a self-conscious element where we realized for the first time that American Jewry as its own entity wielded power. And there's something else that happened for the first time, where it's the first time that different denominations and communities and societies put their differences aside and said, let's come together for a greater cause. It has always struck me that the formation of American Jewry, unfortunately, was forged through tragedy and through coming together to advocate against anti-Semitism. I believe that this is still, unfortunately, the model that we live with today, where the one thing that we're able to come together for, the one thing that's able to bridge those differences in our society is when there's an outside attack, outside pressure. And we've seen this over the past year or two more than ever with Khalila, all of these attacks in shuls and in Jewish communities. We know that there is a power in persecution that unlocks that hidden unity that always remains just underneath the surface. But when you put pressure in that pot, the unity coalesces, and we have a very self-conscious coming together. Anybody who's ever put together a program, forget about different denominations, different communities, two shuls getting together in Queens, it's like brokering the Middle East process sometimes with whose logo is going where. Well, we want our logo in the top corner. Okay, well, we also want the top corner. Okay, we get the right corner. No, we wanted the right corner for the logos. I'm involved in logo negotiations all the time. And it's a reality. You know, everybody, when coming together, it's very hard to put our own unique characters and personalities, especially our organizational personalities, aside. But this is how we were forged in 1840. We became a self-conscious American community and began to have the power to coordinate and come together. But of course, that's not the only thing that happened in 1840. And this, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I want to share with you what is really an absolutely brilliant article from Israel Bartel, which I'm happy to send the PDF to anybody. I'll put my email address inside. If you can't get the PDF, you don't have access to JSTOR or academia. It's called Messianism and Nationalism, Liberal Optimism versus Orthodox Anxiety. And this is what he writes. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger so you can see it really clearly. A new age began for our nation in the year 5600, with both its material and spiritual events. Those who reckoned the end of days had been waiting for that year. That year had already been singled out precisely as if in a prophecy in the Holy Zohar, which we will read soon. Thus did Yaakov Lifshitz. Yaakov Lifshitz was the right-hand man to a person who's famous for multiple reasons, Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, or you may know him from his famous acronym, REIT, Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. Yeshiva University's rabbinical school was named after him. So his right-hand man, not so much has changed since 1840. You know, all the Gedolim, all the Jewish leaders, you always have to wonder, you know, are they answering the question or is their right-hand person answering the question? The Aruch HaShulchan once sent a letter to Rav Yitzchak Elchanan, and he said, I'm not sure who's going to answer the question. I don't know if it's going to be Rav Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, or maybe it's one of his handlers. His main handler was somebody named Yaakov Lifshitz. If any of you, I'm trying to gauge from the crowd, if there are any subscribers to the Yated Ne'eman. Doesn't really look like a Yated Ne'eman crowd to me. It's okay if you're not. Now, I don't hold anything against you. My father's a Yatzid Nemon subscriber, gives us good fodder and a little bit of humor and kibitzing at the Shabbos table. A very right-wing from newspaper. His great-great-grandson is Penny Lifshitz, who runs the newspaper. So this is what Yaakov Lifshitz said. Yaakov Lifshitz, one of the most prominent Orthodox activists in the Russian Empire, the author of Zichron Yaakov, the history of the Jews in Russia and Poland, which happens to be a page turner if you've ever read it, and a consistent opponent of Haskalah and Zionism, began his description of the 7th century and the 6th millennia following the creation of the world. On the basis of a passage in the Zohar, Lifshitz associated the end of the 5th, 6th century in the year 5600 with the hopes of redemption. According to Lifshitz, the apocalyptics calculated that this year was the time set for redemption. According to the tradition, as with every other year concerning which there were allusions to the end of days and redemption, which because of the sins of the generation that did not merit redemption, was a time of untoward events, disasters, and evil decrees, so too they calculated that the year 5600 was a set time, and its many untoward events and disasters are well known. What he's saying is we thought Mashiach was going to come. We thought there'd be this massive transition. We thought we'd see that third Noach, but we didn't get any of it. Why? So he blames it on a lot of the advancements. The Zohar also alludes to the era that began in 1840 as the age of modern scientific and technological discoveries. In Lifshitz's words, starting in the year 5600, the vision of the Holy Zohar, that at that date the gates of wisdom would be opened, was realized. The construction of railroads and steamships proliferated. An epoch, along with the inventions of matches, the telegraph, gas lights, and electricity, and later the telephone and phonograph, as well as many other inventions in every other branch of technology and scientific disciplines. In our country, too, which was then in a wild state, the government began to pave the first highway from Petersburg to Warsaw in the year 5600. Many associated this with the biblical verse, build up a highway. The construction of this road was a great marvel for many. Nevertheless, the beginning of the new age of technology, of which the author was well aware, and which he associated in his book with the vast social and economic changes that took place in the Russian Empire during the second half of the 19th century, also marked the inception of two great evils that would chart the course of the Jews in the modern age: the birth of the Haskalah and the rise of anti-Semitism. So according to Lifshitz, 1840 did not turn out to be the year that he thought it would be. Wow, Rabbi Schiffman, that is very quick on the draw with the PDFs. I'm very impressed right now. 1840 did not turn out to be the year that they expected it to be. We thought that there would be this great awakening of Yiddishkeit and a messianic Mashiach would come riding in, but all this technology led to what? It led to modernity and Haskalah, and it led to anti-Semitism. Nothing came out of it. On the flip side, in this article, he highlights what was happening in the liberal streams of Judaism. For those who know, the Reform movement in 1840 really coalesced and began with the Habsburg Temple. And they started building these unbelievable temples that had these big fights. What were the fights over? The very word temple. If you've ever noticed, there's no Orthodox synagogue, to my knowledge at least, that uses the word temple in its name. Why not? Because there was theological significance to the use of the word temple. They believed, and they couch it in this very same Zohar. They believed that this modernity, this is the Mashiach. This is it. We don't have to be ghetto Jews. We don't have to be cloistered up in the clois inside of the Beis Medrash, studying Torah, divorced from the rest of society. Finally, for the first time, there was a liberal awakening, which more liberal ends of the Jewish spectrum said, this is what we've been waiting for. This is our Beis HaMikdash, which is why when they were building shuls in Germany and throughout Europe, they called them temples. Why? It was literally, to them, the embodiment of this redemptive spirit. And there were great rabbis who, because of this Zohar, actually advocated we should abolish Tisha B'Av. This is it. This is the beauty, this is the wonder that we have all been waiting for. The Mashiach is here. He resides in Germany and throughout Europe, in our temples throughout the country. And this is the revolution that we have been waiting for. Of course, this is a false dichotomy. And Israel Bartel, for as wonderful as an article as this is, and he does talk about how this affected the Zionist movement. You should know Theodore Herzl grew up in a shul whose rabbi was also very much influenced from this passage in Zohar. You could read the PDF. Theodore Herzl grew up in a synagogue where the rabbi was talking about this nonstop. The capacity to kind of take our own destiny into our own hands. And it absolutely influenced the Zionist awakening that we saw following 1840. Mindy just proved me wrong. Mindy's iPhone just proved it. Temple Beth El in Borough Park, now Young Israel, was Orthodox. Okay, we have to do a little bit of sociological archaeology to find out what denomination it was when it was founded. Possible it went back and forth, but I'm happy to be proven wrong. But most temples, if you would take a poll of all the temples around the world, are certainly not of the Orthodox persuasion. And I have no offense to any, I should have done my research, make sure that your shul is not called the temple. I have no offense to anybody who does go to a shul or knows a shul that is called the temple. But the initial revolution began, and you could look at this, the temple wars of 1840, Habsburg temple, and a lot of these places, a lot of it was the polemics were surrounding the very name and possession of the word, the appropriation of the word temple to describe a synagogue in the diaspora. But this is a false dichotomy. We do not ascribe, in my opinion, to either of these views. The people in our communities, in contemporary Orthodox society, we don't look at modernity as being the embodiment of the Mashiach, and we also don't look at it as a Jewish antichrist of sorts, a Jewish impediment to anything holy and anything sacred. And this middle ground is what brings me and brought me that affinity to 1840 and brings all of us back to where everything really comes back to, and that is Dr. Elman. Dr. Elman, for those of you who may or may not know, I have a unique biographical educational history. I am one of the first people to switch from Ner Yisroel in Baltimore, where I learned for 4.5 years and had wonderful, absolutely wonderful years. And I switched to learn in Yeshiva University. But that's not what makes me unique. That makes me different. It doesn't make me unique. What makes me unique is that the reason why I switched was to study Hasidus. I switched from Ner Yisroel to YU to study Hasidus. Never in the history of the world has anybody made that decision. Now, why would I want to study Hasidus? I wanted to study a very specific strain of Polish Hasidus. People always ask me, why would you want to study Polish Hasidus? I always tell them it was for the money. No, that's not true. Don't go into Polish Hasidus for the money. Your phone will not be ringing off the hook from investment banks for your analysis of contemporary Polish Hasidus. In fact, I went to study the works of a scholar named Reb Tzadok HaKohen Melublin. Reb Tzadok was born in 1823 and he died in 1900. And he had an extraordinarily difficult and somewhat tragic life. He was married 3 times. His first marriage ended in a divorce of sorts. It did not end well. His second marriage, his wife passed away, and he got married at the very end of his life for the 3rd time. And he was never merited to have children, and it weighed on him his entire life. That he never merited to have children. It was something that was very hard for him. He's one of the only people throughout Jewish history who wrote an entire theological work on the struggle of having children and what that means and how to deal with that difficulty. There are no other works, to my knowledge, throughout Jewish history that were dedicated just to that struggle. And the reason why he named his works on the Parsha Pri Tzaddik is because he looked at his very ideas and his students as his peiros, as the fruits of his labor, and as his family of sorts. Reb Tzadok HaKohen Melublin, much like myself, if I may say so, did not grow up Hasidish. He grew up, I don't know if we could call it modern Orthodox, but he grew up a regular yeshiva boy. And then when he was traveling after his first marriage fell apart, he was traveling alone by himself throughout Europe. And we have Svarim that talk about, there's a sefer called the Shoel Umeshiv of Shoel Nathanson, who writes, he has a tshuva where he writes, this man Tzadok wandered into my base medrash and asked me the following amazing question. Tzadok was wandering alone. He was a genius of geniuses. And that's not because we had an art scroll biography about him. We know what he wrote on for his bar mitzvah. We know all of this stuff. So Reb Tzadok became Hasidish in the middle of his life. You should know, and this brings us back to Dr. Elman and my switch from Ner Yisrael to Yeshiva University. The first person to write about Reb Tzadok in the English language was Dr. Yaakov Elman. He began, you could chart his whole career. I started writing originally in the Jewish Observer, and then he got progressively more academic and scholarly. His entire career, and he eventually became a world-renowned academic Talmud professor. The seeds for his interest eventually became the Zoroastrian culture and its interchange with Talmudic wisdom. That began from his interest in Reb Tzadok, because Reb Tzadok was a believer in what's a word known in German as the Zeitgeist, as the signs of the times, the culture of every specific generation has an energy to it. There are trends in every generation. And Reb Tzadok believed in a spiritual zeitgeist. Every generation has a spiritual hunger and fervor for different trends and different ideas. And Reb Tzadok landed in the base medrash of Ishbitz. The Ishbitzer Rebbe was extraordinarily controversial, and he landed in his base medrash in 1853. I know I'm throwing out a lot of dates, but we'll try to keep it. And anybody can ask questions if you have any. Why was Ishbitz controversial? Ishbitz was extraordinarily controversial. If you know the history of Hasidus, I call Ishbitz Hasidus, which was founded by Rav Mordechai Yosef Leiner, in what year? I'll give you one guess, 1840. It was started in 1840 as a third revolution, which we will now discuss. Hasidus itself was a revolution. Hasidus was a revolution in that it woke up the Jewish people. The story that they tell about the Baal Shem Tov is that he was called the Baal Shem Tov because the Gemara in Megillah says the Jewish people were dozing off, they were falling asleep, and the Gemara in Megillah says when you're falling asleep, like when you're dozing off and you like start like shuckling, you start like the nap shuckle, you're half going like you're either paying a lot of attention or you're totally passed out. At that stage, the Gemara says, if you call the person, Mom, Dad, wake up, Josh, Dovid, Mordechai, whatever, you call somebody's name, they wake up. So the first revolution was the revolution of the Baal Shem Tov. The Jewish people were falling asleep, and the Baal Shem Tov called out the name of the Jewish people. And then progressively, after the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid of Mezrich went around and he franchised what I call, he was the Ray Kroc to the Baal Shem Tov's McDonald's brothers. And I apologize in advance for the irreverent analogy. McDonald's was started by the McDonald's brothers, but who's the one who brought it throughout the country? If you've read anything about McDonald's or saw the movie starring Michael Keaton, you would know that it was Ray Kroc who really went around and started franchising the movement. That was the Maggid of Mezrich. The Maggid of Mezrich had a student named the Chose Melublin. The Chose Melublin, he had a student named the Noam Elimelech, and his student was the Chose Melublin. This is when Hasidus became Rebbish. This is when Hasidus became about, connecting to a Rebbe and using a Rebbe as living vicariously spiritually through a Rebbe, which is a good thing and a helpful thing for a lot of people. But the second revolution was a break off from this very Rebbe-oriented Hasidus. People looked at themselves and they said, is this what we woke up for? So there could be one person at the head of the tish leading the whole room in singing and laughter and excitement. We want to be involved in this too. Hasidus isn't for Rebbes. Hasidus is for the Hasidim. So there was a break off. And that break-off was called Pershischa Chasidus. Pershischa Chasidus began with the Yid HaKadosh. I have a whole chart to flow this out. The Yid HaKadosh, if you just listen to his name, it was a big break-off from the Choza Melublin. The Choza was called the seer. He was like a prophet. The Yid HaKadosh was just called a holy Jew. A holy Jew. And his student was Reb Simcha Banim of Peshischa, who was the first modern Orthodox Hasidic leader. He was not just a Hasidic Rebbe, he was also a pharmacist. He used to play cards and gamble a little bit. He had a very rambunctious personality. And then finally, again, the first revolution was the Baal Shem Tov. The second revolution was Peshischa. The student of Peshischa, of Reb Simcha Banim, we started with the Yid HaKadosh, then we went to Simcha Banim. His student was the famous Rebbe of Kutsk. There's a fabulous book by Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great scholar of Hasidus, the great scholar, is a Zion of the great Hasidic family, a passion for truth. He wrote a wonderful book about the Kutzker that's definitely worth reading, a fabulous book. I don't know if you're going to be allowed to put that in there. Cards and gambling is modern Orthodox. Depends which part of the modern Orthodox community you're in. I don't know. I'm not advocating anything. I'm just telling over his biography. I don't want to gloss over it. He was a card player. I'm not endorsing, God forbid. I don't think he was at the casino. You know what I mean? Like, I think it was a little bit more informal than that. The Kutzker Rebbe was fire and brimstone about truth. He was about MS, truth. He said that for me, I just want authenticity. I want people who are willing to go to the top of the mountain and scream, Mila Hashem Elai, Hashem Hu Elokim. I go scream to the top of the mountain, I believe in God. It was his unbridled attachment to honesty and authenticity that led to the third revolution that we're going to begin with now. And that was the revolution of Ishbitz. The Ishbitzer Rebbe broke off from Kutsk. And I want to show you why. The Ishbitzer Rebbe essentially said, the Kutzker Rebbe is the express train. The Kutzker Rebbe has an elitist connection to truth. But you know what? Chasidus and the beauty of religiosity and the beauty of Judaism can't just be for people who are willing to be totally authentic and scream the name of God at the top of the mountain. If Kutsk was the express train, then Ishbitz ran local. This is what his grandson writes as the introduction to all of Ishbitz Chasidus. His grandson was famous for being a scientist and scholar. He's the one who brought back Techeles the first time, Radziner Techeles, which is not the ones that people who wear Techeles normally wear, but he writes as follows. Va'adoni avi v'mori hu haya ha'meyuchad b'cheder Rabbeinu Simcha Banim. He was unique in the court of Simcha Banim of Peshischa. Teshimish kol tzarcho v'lo mashme o al Torah. He did not move from that court. Va'achar histalkus Rabbeinu Simcha Banim, after Simcha Banim died, Shalosh, look at, he's now describing his time in Kutsk. Shalosh asara shana saval tsar hachavas maras adulam. He was hiding out in the cave of Adulam. That's where Dovid HaMelech hid when he was hiding for his life, escaping Shaul HaMelech. Shalo hagia ha'es adayin lilmo Torah barabim b'farhasya. It wasn't yet his time. V'nasho b'toch l'ba'im shachna v'limid Torah b'tzina. He learned quietly v'esatznuim chachma ad eis bad dvar Hashem, until it was time for the word of God came to him. V'hegia hazman v'ruach Hashem, and the moment came, and the Spirit of God eichal lefamo came to him when Bishna Sheish Me'el LaElef Hashishi, 5600 in 1840. Hu ha'es asher olav remez Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This is the time that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says in the Zohar HaKadosh, and I'll read the translation over here. Ubeshis Meya, I'll read the translation. We don't have to read the difficult Aramaic. Kasher Yavo Elef Hashishi Shehu Sod Havav Ubeshelish Me'el LaElef Hashishi Yiftachu Sharei Chachma Lamaila. The gates of wisdom are going to be opened up. I'm not going to read the rest of the Zohar. I'm a little worried about time, and I want to make sure we get to our point. V'hainu sheyiskarvu hadivrei Torah lehasagas ha'adam v'tifisaso. what was going to happen in this year of 1840. The words of Torah are going to become accessible to man and his grasp. Al Yidei Sheyavin Shekol HaDivrei Torah. All of the words of Torah, Heim Tzrichen L'Kol Yisrael La'avodas Hashem Yisparach. This is a time where Torah will reach all of the Jewish people in order to serve God. I'm just going to read that over here, this next paragraph. Shetzarech liyesod nafsho hadivrei Torah hayoser yikarim. That for the essence, the essential definition of our own lives, how we build our own essential identities, Torah, religiosity, Yiddishkeit, and God are now necessary. The Yavod as Hashem Yisbarach al Yidei hadivrei Torah. Va'oz shalach Hashem min hashamayim v'yoshiu v'shalach lo chazdo v'amito. This will be how God sends us that redemption. V'ha'inyan sheramaz Rabbi Shimon, and what that Zohar was saying, that alluding to in 5600, hazo sheyiftchu mevoed de chachma, af shematzinu kama pa'amim b'zohar hakadosh. We see this many, many times. Mashehiz here, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, shalol legalos sisrei Torah, not to teach any mystical ideas. He says now is different. Now is a time where the mystical underpinnings and how Torah is relevant for all of society is finally accessible. This is what was the founding doctrine of Ishbitz Chasidus. And this brings us back to 2020. There's a fabulous, intriguing, somewhat controversial scholar named Yuval Harari. He has a wonderful book called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. I always was fascinated by this passage. Yuval Harari is secular, not religious at all, not a lick. He writes as follows: as robots and AI push humans out of the job market, the ultra-Orthodox may come to be seen as the model of the future rather than a fossil of the past. Not that everyone will become Orthodox Jews and go to yeshiva to study Talmud, but in the lives of all people, the quest for meaning and for community might eclipse the quest for a job. I think of this passage anytime I reflect on this year. If there's anything that has marked this year as unique, it's the question of what does it mean to be essential? What is essential in our lives? What are the things that ultimately matter in our lives? When we're forced in isolation, when we're forced away from one another, how do we then build meaning? If it's not going to be going to work and camaraderie at the water cooler, how do we find meaning and build purpose in our lives? In many ways, this was the question of 1840. As technology displaced so many people, throngs of society needed to turn to other crevices and corners and figure out new ways to build meaning in their lives. The technology that was ushered in 1840, the developments and the moment that we live in now in 2020, it's not that technology is the Mashiach, and it's not that technology prevented the Mashiach. It's that we live in a time where for the first moment, it is normal and healthy, however much anxiety it may induce, ask ourselves, what is essential? What really matters? What is really important to us? To make the quest for building Torah, for building identity and Torah, to be a part of our quest for meaning is something that as an entire society, we've all been engaged in. What does community even mean? And this is a moment that we are in right now, which makes 2020 in many ways a reverberation of the questions and the pursuits that we've now looked at and been dealing with in the year 2020. Allow me to close with two very brief ideas. I feel like I can't end without an idea from Reb Tzadok HaKohen Melublin. There's a beautiful Reb Tzadok that I quote at the bottom over here. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says, Yiftach bedoro kishmuel bedoro. That Yiftach in his generation, Yiftach was one of the great Shoftim, was like Shmuel in his generation. Says Reb Tzadok, Yiftach in his generation was like Shmuel in his generation. That's not a consolation prize. That's not telling us that, oh, okay, the previous rabbis were better, but you'll make do with your rabbis, they're okay too. Yiftach isn't just a noun. Yiftach is a verb. Derosa Lomar, says Rav Tzadok, Misha Poseach Shar Chodesh Ba'avodas Hashem Yisparach B'doro. Somebody who is Yiftach, who opens up a new doorway, a new entry point for exploration of Jewish ideas, of meaningful ideas, of mystical ideas, of ideas that guide us to what really makes us essential. Hu hamanhig ha'amiti k'Shmuel b'doro. That is what leadership looks like. That is what Shmuel did in his generation. You want to be like Shmuel? Be like Yiftach. Not Yiftach the judge, Yiftach the verb. Open up a new doorway for somebody else. And I think it's therefore appropriate to end the year, as we end the year before Rosh Hashanah, we always say, Tichla Shana v'kiloseha, Tochel Shana ubirchoseha. I wrote recently for tablet. I do a lot of writing for tablet. I write a thematic essay at the end of every Masechta and Daf Yomi for tablet. I'm involved in their Take One podcast, their Daf Yomi podcast. I don't think the target audience necessarily is here, but it's a wonderful, gives you a nugget of wisdom and inspiration on each daf. And this is what I wrote. And so now that it's almost New Year's Eve and our minds are still set on renewal, let us remember one last teaching as we prepare for the final leg of this terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year. The Gemara in Megillah says that we read the curses at the end of the Torah right before Rosh Hashanah as a reminder that the year should end along with its curses and a new year should begin with all of its blessings. This year, 2020, certainly feels like an apt year for such a prayer. But 1840 is a reminder that blessings don't emerge in a vacuum. They arise not in spite of generational challenges, but because of the challenges that each year faces. So in that sense, 2020 should end along with its curses and propel us to see the blessings and opportunities that 2021 brings our way. If we are ever to greet that third Noach, the Noach after the trauma, the Noach after the flood, it's going to be with that Tachel Shana v'kiloseha and allow us to be matchil a new Shana ubirchoseha. They're connected to one another. You don't get the Noach of bracha without first having the Noach of the Mabul. And the only way to do that is where everybody else in the generation sees exit signs, where everybody else in the generation says do not enter signs. We need to be the generation that says yiftach, that says enter signs, that builds new entry points, new points of inspiration, new points for building meaning. And with that, it is my bracha and my privilege to share with you that this coming year should be filled with bracha, nachas, health, happiness, and safety for all of us. And it should be a year where we continue to build meaning and finally find that third Noach rebuilding after the flood that we've all been through. So thank you all so very much. And please, I'm sorry to end on this note. You'll kill me. I'm never going to be invited back. It's okay. But I'm asking Dr. Elman's daughter, who I don't even think I caught your name, if you want to be in touch, I have documents from your father, his corrections on my old papers that are really a big joy to read through. He used to mark my papers in all caps, which was an absolute nightmare. You could see his notes over there. He would make jokes. He would make fun of me. He would call me yeshivish. I used the word amongst one time in one of my papers. He said, cut it out. You're not British, in all caps. So I'm happy to share that with you, and really to share ideas and meaning together tonight is something that I found extraordinarily meaningful. So thank you all so very much.
Thank you. You should know that Rabbi Bashevkin, my mother and my brother are also on tonight. Oh. They came a little bit later, but they're here.
Wow. So that's really a privilege. I think I may have given your brother that paper. Anything else I have, it's really a privilege to be with the family of my Mori Rabbi, my teacher. It's something very, very special. And his teacher, Rav Hutner, was a student, not literally, but was influenced by the Ishbitzer, the one academic paper.
And the Cuts, yeah,
the one academic paper that came out in Rav Hutner's lifetime by Stephen Schwarzschild was about the Ishbitz influences on Rav Hutner. And your father once told me that he believes And your father was an academic. He says, I believe be'emuna shalema, he said, that Rav Hutner had Ruach HaKodesh. I was like, whoa. You don't hear that every day from a Talmud scholar. But tonight was so special, and please, I hope we're all in touch going forward.
Amen. I want to just say this, Rabbi Bashevkin. This is Yitz Elman speaking. I don't think we've met, but what you described from the student from the Talmud side, we grew up with, obviously, around the table. And when my father started talking about this, and we were kids, I remember speaking to him, saying, "Ty, I don't think the world is ready for this. Maybe you should think before you start really, because people are going to think you're, Baruch Hashem, he didn't listen."
Thank God the world became ready. The world is ready.
Exactly. But
Nahara.
you're absolutely right. Everything you said is accurate from our experience, how he evolved and what he spoke about. And it's a real honor for us and real pleasure to have listened to you tonight. And hopefully we'll stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. Have a great night, and we will be Bekesher. A happy New Year to everybody.
Here,
Also.
we really appreciate it. It was great to have you. Mishmar is starting right now, right here on this Zoom. Everyone's please welcome to attend. Thank you very much, Rabbi Bashevkin.
Take care.